Number 10. The Toba supereruption, the winter that nearly ended us, approximately 74,000 years ago, on the island we now call Sumatra. The Earth opened with a force almost impossible to imagine. The Toba supervolcano erupted and threw a volume of ash and magma into the atmosphere so vast that it dwarfed every eruption witnessed in recorded history. Forests were buried, rivers were choked, ash fell across oceans and continents, covering parts of South Asia beneath a suffocating layer of volcanic debris. To any living creature under that cloud, the eruption would not have looked like a natural event. It would have looked like the end of the sky. The sun dimmed, the air filled with poison dust, and the world that our ancestors knew began to disappear beneath grey silence. The immediate destruction was only the first stage. The Toba blasted sulfur into the upper atmosphere, where it spread into a veil of particles that reflected sunlight away from the planet. What followed was a volcanic winter, a sudden cooling that may have lasted for years, with longer climatic effects stretching across generations. Plants failed. Animals migrated, starved, or died. Food chains broke in places where human groups had depended on wild plants, game, shellfish, and seasonal patterns they had learned over thousands of years. Our ancestors did not have cities, granaries, medicine, metal tools, or written warnings. They had fire, stone, memory, and each other. And suddenly, the world around them became colder, darker, and less generous. What makes Toba so terrifying is the possibility that it struck when Homo sapiens was still fragile. We were not yet masters of the planet. We were scattered populations, surviving in pockets of Africa and moving slowly into parts of Asia. Other human species still existed. The future did not belong to us yet. Then came a disaster large enough to reduce habitats, collapse food supplies, and isolate surviving groups from one another. Genetic evidence has long suggested that humanity passed through severe ancient bottlenecks, periods when the number of breeding individuals became frighteningly small. Whether Toba caused the deepest of those bottlenecks or only worsened one already unfolding, the idea remains chilling. The entire future of our species may have narrowed to scattered bands of survivors living under a damaged sky. Imagine the human world after the eruption. No maps, no explanation, no knowledge that a volcano far away had changed the climate of half the planet. Only the evidence of disaster, colder nights, dimmer days, hungry children, animals gone from familiar hunting grounds, plants failing where they once returned every season. Groups that had survived for generations may have vanished without leaving a single tool behind. Languages died before writing could preserve them. Stories ended inside families that had no descendants. Every person alive today comes from the lines that did not break, but countless other lines must have ended in the cold, in hunger, in migration, or in landscapes transformed beyond recognition. The most disturbing part is how small the margin may have been. Human survival was not guaranteed by intelligence alone. Intelligence does not create food where ecosystems have collapsed. Language does not stop ash from falling. Fire does not bring back herds that have disappeared. And our ancestors survived because some groups happened to be in the right refuges, near enough water, food, coastlines, caves, or adaptable resources to endure the worst years. They survived because someone remembered where to find shellfish, how to follow animals, how to keep children warm, how to move before a place became unlivable. Civilization did not save them. There was no civilization, only small human groups making decisions in a world that had become hostile. That is why the Toba supereruption belongs among the prehistoric catastrophes that almost erased humanity. It was not just a volcano, it was a test of whether our species could pass through darkness before history had even begun. The people who survived it did not know they were carrying the future of every city, every language, every empire, every song, every invention, and every human life that would follow. They were simply trying to live through the next cold season. And that is the horror of Toba. The modern world may descend from people who never knew how close they came to being the last humans on Earth. Number 9, the Campanian Ignimbrite, the volcano that struck 2 human species, Approximately 39,000 years ago, in what is now southern Italy, a volcanic field beneath the land around Campi Flegrei erupted with a force that turned part of Europe into a landscape of ash, fire, and poisoned air. This was not an ordinary eruption rising from a single mountain cone. It was a massive explosive event from a restless volcanic system, releasing clouds of burning material, ash, and gas across enormous distances. The eruption column climbed into the sky and spread volcanic debris far beyond Italy. Ash from the event has been found across parts of Europe and Western Asia, marking a layer in the earth like a dark line drawn through human prehistory. For the people living beneath that sky, there was no warning written in science, no understanding of magma chambers or volcanic aerosols. There was only the sudden transformation of the world into darkness. The timing is what makes this catastrophe so haunting. When Campi Flegrei erupted, Europe was not inhabited by one human story, but two. Modern humans were spreading into the continent, carrying new tools, ornaments, social networks, and ways of surviving. Neanderthals, our closest human cousins, had already lived there for hundreds of thousands of years. They knew the caves, valleys, coasts, forests, animals, and seasonal dangers of that land in ways we can barely imagine. They had survived ice ages, hunted large game, used fire, made tools, cared for their injured, and buried their dead. But by the time the ash began to fall, Neanderthal populations were already under pressure. Their numbers were shrinking, their territories were contracting. Their world was becoming colder, more unstable, and more crowded with newcomers. Then the eruption struck both species at once. Ashfall could bury vegetation, poison water sources, disrupt animal migrations, and destroy the places where hunter-gatherers depended on predictable food. Sulfur released into the atmosphere may have cooled the climate further, turning already harsh ice age conditions into something even more difficult to survive. For small, scattered populations, even a few failed seasons could be fatal. A hunting group might return to find familiar valleys empty. A cave that had sheltered generations might now face a landscape where animals no longer passed. Plants, wood, clean water, and prey could disappear from territories that had once supported life. The eruption did not need to kill everyone directly. It only needed to make survival slightly harder for groups already living near the edge. What makes the Campanian Ignimbrite especially disturbing is the way it appears near one of the greatest disappearances in human history. Around this period, Neanderthal traces become increasingly rare. Their tools vanish from many regions. Their populations fade from the archaeological record. The exact cause of their extinction is still debated. Climate change, competition, disease, interbreeding, small population size, and bad luck all played their parts. But this eruption may have been one of the blows that turned decline into collapse. It did not choose between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens. It darkened the sky above both. Yet when the long aftermath ended, one human species remained dominant in Europe, and the other was gone. The horror is not that a volcano alone erased the Neanderthals. The horror is that extinction rarely needs one clean cause. It builds from pressure, a colder century, a failed hunt, a lost child, a disease brought by strangers, a shrinking group with too few mates, a valley buried in ash, a sky that dims at the wrong moment. Campi Flegrei may have arrived when the Neanderthals could no longer absorb another wound. Modern humans were wounded too, but some of our groups survived, moved, adapted, and eventually expanded into the spaces left behind. The eruption became part of a filter, and the species that passed through that filter became the ancestors of the future. That is why the Campanian Ignimbrite belongs among the prehistoric catastrophes that almost erased humanity. It struck during a time when the human family tree still had more than one living branch, and after it, the world moved closer to the lonely condition we know today. The Neanderthals did not vanish like monsters from a myth. They were people of their own kind, with families, memories, skills, and dead they cared enough to bury. Somewhere beneath the ash layer of that ancient eruption lies the story of groups who looked up at a darkened sky and did not know that history was choosing who would continue. The volcano did not end humanity, but it may have helped decide which humanity survived. Number 8. The Younger Dryas Freeze, the climate reversal that broke the first hunters. Approximately 12,900 years ago, the last ice age seemed to be ending. Glaciers were retreating, forests were spreading, rivers were changing course, and the great herds of the Pleistocene were moving through a world that was slowly becoming warmer and more stable. For human hunters, this should have been the beginning of a new age. Across North America, the Clovis people had developed some of the most refined stone tools of the prehistoric world, following mammoths, mastodons, bison, and other giant animals across open landscapes. The climate was shifting in their favor, the ice was loosening its grip. Then, almost without warning in geological terms, the planet turned cold again. And the event is known as the Younger Dryas, a sudden climate reversal that dragged parts of the northern hemisphere back toward ice age conditions for more than 1,000 years. Temperatures dropped sharply. Glaciers advanced again. Forests retreated. Rainfall patterns changed. Ecosystems that had been adapting to warmth were thrown into confusion. To the people living through it, there was no name for the event and no explanation for why the world had betrayed them. They only saw the results: colder seasons, shrinking resources, animals disappearing from familiar routes, plants failing in places where they had always returned, and landscapes that no longer behaved the way memory said they should. What caused the Younger Dryas remains one of the great debates of prehistory. Some scientists point to the sudden release of meltwater from enormous glacial lakes, which may have flooded into the North Atlantic and disrupted the ocean currents that carried heat around the planet. Others argue that a cosmic impact or fragmented comet may have triggered fires, dust, and atmospheric disruption across vast regions. The debate matters, but for the humans and animals caught inside the event, the cause was invisible. Whether the cold came from the ocean, the sky, or both, the effect was the same. A warming planet snapped backward, and everything that depended on stability was forced into crisis. The most devastating consequences struck the megafauna. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, American horses, and many other large animals were already under pressure from changing climates and human hunting. Ting. The Younger Dryas may have been the final shock. Habitats shifted too quickly. Food webs collapsed. Herds fragmented. Species that had survived earlier cold periods could not survive the combined pressure of warming, hunting, sudden cooling, and ecological chaos. Within a relatively short span, much of North America's giant animal world vanished. For human hunters who had built their lives around these animals, this was not just an extinction. It was the collapse of a way of life. The Clovis culture faded around the same time. Their distinctive spear points, once spread across a continent, became rare and then disappeared from the archaeological record. The people did not vanish entirely, but their world did. The tools changed because the lives behind the tools had to change. The hunters who had followed giant prey across open country were forced to adapt to smaller animals, different plants, new territories, and a climate that had become unpredictable. Some groups moved, some merged, some died. Others survived by abandoning the strategies that had once made them successful. The Younger Dryas did not erase humanity, but it broke one of the first great prehistoric systems humans had built in the Americas. What makes this event so haunting is its timing. Humanity was close to a threshold. The world after the Ice Age was beginning to create the conditions that would eventually support agriculture, permanent settlements, and civilization. But the Younger Dryas delayed that future. In some regions, early experiments with settled life were disrupted. Communities that had begun to rely on stable resources were pushed back toward mobility and survival. But the lesson was brutal. Civilization requires climate stability, and stability is not guaranteed. Before humans could build cities, the planet reminded them that the ground beneath history could still move. That is why the Younger Dryas Freeze belongs among the prehistoric catastrophes that almost erased humanity. It did not kill every human group, but it shattered ecosystems, ended the age of many giant animals, disrupted cultures, and nearly changed the direction of human history before civilization began. Our ancestors survived, but they survived a world that could turn against them within a few generations. The hunters who watched the herds disappear did not know they were living through a planetary event. They only knew that the old paths no longer worked, the old animals no longer came, and the cold had returned like a memory the Earth refused to release. Number 7. The Black Sea Flood, the deluge that may have become myth. Approximately 7,600 years ago, the Black Sea may not have been a sea at all, but a vast freshwater lake lying below the level of the Mediterranean. Around its shores, people lived in settlements, farmed, fished, herded animals, and built their lives around water they believed they understood. To them, the lake had edges, seasons, and rhythms. It was not an enemy. It was home. But beyond the ridge of land at the Bosphorus, the rising Mediterranean was climbing higher as the last Ice Age meltwater filled the world's oceans. For generations, pressure built against the barrier separating one body of water from another. Then, according to one of archaeology's most haunting theories, that barrier failed. When the Mediterranean broke through, the flood would not have looked like ordinary rain or a swollen river. It would have looked like the sea itself invading the land. Salt water poured through the gap with unimaginable force, carving the Bosphorus deeper and rushing into the lower basin. The shoreline of the Black Sea may have advanced inland day after day, swallowing fields, camps, houses, graves, and animal pens. People who had lived beside a familiar lake suddenly watched its edge move toward them like a living thing. The water came from a direction no flood had ever come before, and it did not recede. It rose, stayed, and kept rising. What makes the Black Sea flood so disturbing is the scale of human helplessness it suggests. The people caught along those ancient shores had no maps of global sea level, no concept of glacial melt, no way to understand that oceans far away had pushed their world past a breaking point. They could only run uphill, carry children, release animals, abandon tools, leave behind food stores, and watch the places of their ancestors vanish beneath salt water. A settlement can be rebuilt after a storm. A field can recover after a river flood. But when the sea takes the land permanently, survival becomes exile. The people who escaped did not just lose property. They lost the geography that held their memory. The theory becomes even more powerful because of what may have followed. Around the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean, later cultures preserved stories of a great flood that destroyed the world and left only survivors to begin again. Mesopotamian epics, biblical tradition, Greek myth, and other ancient narratives all carry echoes of a deluge so large that it became more than weather. It became judgment, punishment, cleansing, and rebirth. Yet no one can prove that all these stories came from one event, but the possibility is haunting. If survivors of the Black Sea flood carried their memories outward through migration, then the ancient flood myths may contain the emotional fossil of a real catastrophe. This is what makes prehistoric disaster different from written history. A people can lose their homes and still preserve the wound in story. For thousands of years, the details change, names change, gods are added, boats grow larger, heroes become chosen survivors. But beneath the myth, something human remains. The memory of water rising too fast, the terror of leaving everything behind, the belief that the world before the flood was truly gone. If the Black Sea deluge became myth, then oral tradition may have carried an ancestral trauma across more generations than any monument could survive. But the evil flood also changed the movement of people. Communities displaced from the basin may have pushed into Europe, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia, carrying farming knowledge, tools, animals, and stories with them. Disaster became migration, and migration became cultural change. The drowning of one landscape could help reshape others far beyond the shoreline. That is the hidden power of catastrophes like this. They do not end when the water stops rising. They continue inside the survivors, in the places they settle, in the skills they carry, in the warnings they tell their children, and in the myths their descendants later write down as sacred truth. That is why the Black Sea flood belongs among the prehistoric catastrophes that almost erased humanity. It did not wipe out the entire species, but for the people who lived beside that ancient lake, it may have erased the whole world they knew. And their villages disappeared beneath a new sea, their dead were left underwater, their children inherited exile. And if the memory of that disaster survived as the great flood stories of later civilizations, then the Black Sea did more than drown land. It drowned a world so completely that only myth could keep it breathing. Number 6. The Storegga tsunami, the wave that drowned Doggerland. Approximately 8,200 years ago, a land that no longer exists lay between Britain and continental Europe. Today, that place is buried beneath the North Sea, but in the Mesolithic world, it was a real homeland of rivers, marshes, forests, lakes, and open ground. Modern researchers call it Doggerland. To the people who lived there, it was not a lost world. It was simply where they hunted, fished, gathered plants, made tools, raised children, and followed the seasonal movements of animals. Britain was not yet an island in the way we know it now. The sea was rising as the last ice age ended, but Doggerland still remained above the water in places, a shrinking landscape where generations had watched the shoreline creep closer without knowing that one final disaster was waiting offshore. But the catastrophe began far to the north, off the coast of what is now Norway. A massive section of the continental shelf collapsed beneath the sea in one of the largest submarine landslides of the Holocene. This event, known as the Storegga slide, displaced an enormous volume of sediment and water, creating a tsunami that raced across the North Atlantic. Waves struck the coasts of Norway, Scotland, and the remaining lowlands of Doggerland with terrifying force. For communities living on flat land near rivers and marshes, there would have been little time to understand what was coming. The sea would have pulled back or begun to behave strangely, and then a wall of water would have crossed the horizon. What made the Storegga tsunami so destructive was the vulnerability of the world it hit. Doggerland was already dying slowly. The rising seas had been breaking it apart for thousands of years, turning broad territories into islands, wetlands, and coastal refuges. The people living there may have adapted to change gradually, moving camps, following animals, and shifting with the coast. But gradual change is not the same as survival against a wave. A tsunami does not negotiate with memory or adaptation. It arrives all at once. Camps would have been crushed, fires drowned, food stores washed away, fresh water contaminated with salt. Children, elders, tools, dogs, shelters, and the dead of earlier generations could have vanished in a single morning. The wave did not need to kill everyone to end a world. Even survivors would have faced a broken homeland. Low-lying forests could become salt marsh. Hunting grounds could disappear. Fishing places could be filled with debris. And the animals people depended on would have fled or died. A group that survived the wave might climb to higher ground and look back at a landscape they could no longer use. In that moment, Doggerland was no longer a home, slowly shrinking over generations. It was a place that had become unsafe in one violent act. The people who escaped would have had to move toward what is now Britain or the European mainland, carrying only what they could hold and leaving the rest beneath the water. What makes Doggerland haunting is that it vanished so completely. For thousands of years, no one remembered it as a country beneath the sea. Fishermen later pulled up bones, tools, antler points, and fragments from the North Sea floor without always knowing that they were touching the remains of a drowned landscape. Modern surveys have revealed ancient river channels, hills, valleys, and traces of the world that once connected lands now separated by water. It was not empty wilderness, it was inhabited ground, a human landscape erased before writing, before cities, before anyone could draw a map and say this place was ours. The Storegga tsunami belongs among the prehistoric catastrophes that almost erased humanity because it shows how easily an entire people's world can disappear without ending the species. Humanity survived, but Doggerland did not. Its communities were scattered, absorbed, or lost among other groups. Their names, languages, stories, and memories dissolved into populations that would later become part of Europe's deep ancestry. Somewhere beneath the North Sea, the bones of animals, tools of hunters, and perhaps the remains of people still lie in sediment that was once dry land. The wave came, the sea stayed, and a human homeland vanished so completely that we had to rediscover it from the bottom of the ocean. Number 5, the drying of the Green Sahara, the desert that forced civilization. Approximately 14,000 years ago, the Sahara was not the endless desert we know today. It was a green world of lakes, rivers, grasslands, wetlands, and scattered forests stretching across North Africa. Monsoon rains reached far north of where they fall now, filling basins that are now dry sand and stone. Hippos lived in Saharan lakes. Crocodiles moved through rivers that no longer exist. Fish, birds, antelope, elephants, giraffes, and early herding communities occupied a landscape that would be almost unrecognizable to modern eyes. The people who lived there did not see themselves as desert survivors. They lived in a fertile world, one that gave them water, animals, fish, pasture, and enough stability to build traditions around a land that seemed alive. This evidence for this lost Sahara is still hidden across the desert. Ancient river channels can be seen from space beneath the sand. Fossil lake beds mark places where water once stood for generations. Rock art in the central Sahara shows swimmers, cattle, giraffes, elephants, and human figures moving through a world of abundance. Those images are not fantasies. They are records left by people who saw a Sahara filled with life. They hunted, fished, moved with herds, kept cattle, and painted the animals that shared their world. Every image on those rock walls is a message from a climate that no longer exists, a memory of North Africa before the desert swallowed it. Then the rains began to retreat. The cause was not a single storm, war, or human mistake, but a slow shift in Earth's orbit and the angle of sunlight reaching the northern hemisphere. The monsoons weakened, lakes shrank, rivers became seasonal, then vanished, grasslands dried into scrub, trees died, soil that had once held roots became exposed to wind. Over centuries, and in some places perhaps much faster, the Green Sahara collapsed. To the people living there, this was not an abstract climate transition. It was the death of their world. A lake that fed one generation might become a salt flat for the next. A grazing route used by grandparents might become a corridor of dust for their grandchildren. The human consequences were enormous. Communities that had adapted to the Green Sahara could not simply remain where they were and wait. Their cattle needed pasture, their children needed water, their dead lay in lands that were becoming unlivable. As the desert expanded, people were forced to move. Some went south toward regions where rainfall still survived. Others moved east, following the most reliable water source left in North Africa, the Nile. The river became a refuge, not because it was comfortable, but because everywhere else was failing. People who had once been spread across a vast, fertile Sahara became concentrated in a narrow green corridor between desert walls. That concentration changed history. Along the Nile, displaced groups brought cattle traditions, agricultural knowledge, social organization, and memories of landscapes that had disappeared. Population pressure increased. Communities had to cooperate, store food, manage water, defend territory, and organize labor around the river's seasonal rhythms. Out of this pressure, over time, came the conditions that helped make ancient Egypt possible. The pyramids, temples, writing, kingship, and river-based civilization did not emerge from a peaceful emptiness. They rose, in part, from the consequences of a dying Sahara. A desert helped force people together tightly enough for one of the world's first great civilizations to form. That is what makes the drying of the Green Sahara so haunting. It was not only an environmental change, it was a mass displacement event written into the deep foundations of history. It erased lakes, animals, villages, migration routes, and ways of life whose names we will never know. It turned a living region into a barrier. It forced survivors to abandon the graves of ancestors, the rock walls they had painted, and the world they had trusted. And yet, from that collapse, new forms of human organization emerged. The death of one landscape helped give birth to another kind of world. That is why the drying of the Green Sahara belongs among the prehistoric catastrophes that almost erased humanity. It did not reduce all humans to a handful of survivors, but it erased an entire inhabited world and forced people into migrations that reshaped civilization. The Sahara today looks eternal, as if it has always been sand, silence, and heat. But beneath that silence is the memory of rivers, cattle, fish, swimmers, and families watching the water disappear. The desert did not merely cover the land, it covered a human world so completely that only stone paintings and buried riverbeds remain to prove it was ever green. Number 4. The 8.2 kiloyear event, the climate shock that tested the first farmers. Approximately 8,000 to 200 years ago, humanity had begun one of the most dangerous experiments in its history. After the Ice Age, people in the Near East were no longer only following wild herds and seasonal plants. They were staying in one place, planting crops, keeping animals, building villages, storing food, and trusting the rhythm of rain and harvest. Farming seemed to offer a new kind of security, a way to make the world more predictable. But that security was fragile. The first farmers had built their lives around stable seasons, and they did not yet know that the climate could turn against agriculture as easily as it had once turned against hunters. Then, without warning, the world cooled. The event began far away from the first villages, in the fading ice sheets of North America, and as the glaciers melted, enormous lakes of fresh water collected behind walls of ice. One of them held a volume of water almost impossible to imagine, trapped until the ice barrier finally failed. When it broke, a catastrophic flood of cold, fresh water surged into the North Atlantic. That sudden pulse disrupted the ocean currents that carried warmth through the northern hemisphere. Temperatures dropped. Rainfall patterns shifted. Regions that had been wet enough for farming became dry and unstable. A disaster that began with water escaping from ice on one side of the world reached the fields of people who never knew the lake existed. For early farming communities, the consequences were brutal. Crops that depended on reliable rain failed. Herds weakened. Stored grain became the difference between survival and starvation. The villages that had once looked like the future suddenly became traps, because settled life ties people to the land more tightly than foraging does. A hunter-gatherer group can move when resources collapse. A farming village has houses, fields, animals, graves, and food stores that cannot simply be carried away. The first farmers had gained stability, but they had also gained vulnerability. When the climate shifted, the system that promised security exposed them to a new kind of disaster. The 8.2 kiloyear event did not destroy agriculture, but it tested it before it was fully mature. Some villages shrank, others were abandoned. People moved in search of better water, better soil, and more reliable seasons. Communities that survived had to change the way they lived. They could not simply trust rainfall anymore. They had to store more food, diversify what they grew, manage animals more carefully, and learn how to control water instead of merely waiting for it. The shock did not end the agricultural experiment. It forced it to become harder, smarter, and more organized. That is what makes the event so important. Civilization did not rise because farming was easy. It rose because farming was fragile, and fragility demanded systems. Drought required storage, storage required protection. Irrigation required labor. Labor required coordination. Coordination created leaders, rules, obligations, and conflicts. The first villages were not peaceful stepping stones towards cities. They were pressure chambers where climate, hunger, population, and survival pushed people into new social forms. But the 8.2 kiloyear event revealed that once humans depended on crops, they also depended on the ability to manage failure. The most haunting part is that the people living through it did not understand the cause. They could not know that an ice dam had broken across an ocean. They could not see the currents slowing or the climate system shifting. They only knew that the rain was wrong, the fields were weaker, the animals were thinner, and old expectations no longer worked. Some stayed and adapted. Some left and carried farming knowledge into new lands. Some vanished from the record entirely, their villages reduced to abandoned walls and silent floors. The disaster became part of the movement of people, ideas, crops, and ancestry across Europe and the Near East. That is why the 8.2 kiloyear event belongs among the prehistoric catastrophes that almost erased humanity. IT. It did not push our species to extinction, but it nearly broke one of the foundations on which the modern world would be built. If early farming had failed completely, there may have been no cities, no kingdoms, no writing, no organized states, and no civilization as we understand it. Humanity survived the shock, but only by changing. A flood from a melting ice sheet became a drought in the first fields, and the first farmers learned a lesson that has never stopped being true. The moment humans build their future around the climate holds power over everything they build. Number 3. The Australian megafauna collapse, the lost world that died after humans arrived. When the first humans reached Australia, they entered a continent filled with animals that no longer seem real. Giant kangaroos stood taller than modern people. Wombat-like herbivores grew to the size of rhinoceroses. Enormous, flightless birds moved across open landscapes. Marsupial lions hunted with powerful jaws and retractable claws. Giant lizards longer than crocodiles prowled through a world that had evolved in isolation for millions of years. To the newcomers arriving by sea, Australia was not an empty land. It was a continent of giants, shaped by ancient climates, strange ecosystems, and creatures found nowhere else on Earth. Then, within a few thousand years of human arrival, much of that world disappeared. The timing remains one of the most debated mysteries in prehistory. Some researchers argue that climate change was already transforming the continent, making it drier and more unstable. Others point to human hunting, fire use, and habitat disruption as the decisive force. The most likely answer may be the darkest one. Both pressures arrived together. The megafauna had survived earlier climate swings, but now they faced a new predator with tools, fire, planning, and the ability to reshape landscapes. A world already under stress met a species capable of pushing it past the point of recovery. What makes the Australian collapse so haunting is that it did not leave behind a single battlefield. There was no one extinction site where every giant fell at once. Instead, the disappearance appears across the continent as a spreading silence. Bones become rarer, tracks vanish. A species that had existed for hundreds of thousands or millions of years simply stop appearing in the record. The giant browsers, predators, and birds that once defined Australian ecosystems were gone, leaving behind smaller survivors and landscapes permanently changed by their absence. Their extinction was not only the loss of animals, it was the destruction of an entire ecological order. Human fire may have been one of the most powerful forces in that transformation. Fire can clear land, drive animals, open travel routes, encourage certain plants, and destroy others. In the hands of skilled humans, it becomes a tool for survival. But across a fragile continent, repeated burning can also change vegetation, reduce food sources, and make life harder for large animals that reproduce slowly and need vast ranges. A giant herbivore cannot recover quickly if its habitat is broken, and a large predator cannot survive if the animals it hunts vanish. The death of one species becomes the hunger of another, and the collapse spreads through the food web. The tragedy is that the people who arrived were also survivors. They had crossed open water to reach the continent, carrying knowledge, courage, and social organization strong enough to settle one of the most challenging environments on Earth. They were not villains in a simple story. They were humans trying to live. But human survival has consequences. Wherever our species went, we brought new pressure into old ecosystems. We hunted, burned, adapted, remembered, and multiplied. In Australia, that pressure met a climate already turning harsher, and the giants did not have enough time to adjust. What makes this event especially disturbing is how completely the lost world has vanished from memory. No city recorded the last giant kangaroo. No written account described the final marsupial lion. No monument was built for the enormous birds or the massive browsing animals that disappeared before history began. Their world survives only in bones, footprints, kebbid deposits, and scientific arguments over blame. The people who may have seen them alive left no written testimony. The animals died before they could become legend in any form we can clearly recover. We know they existed, but we do not know the stories ancient people told about them around firelight. That is why the Australian megafauna collapse belongs among the prehistoric catastrophes that almost erased humanity. It did not nearly kill all humans, but it reveals the terrifying power humans carried even before civilization, farming, metal, or cities. Our species was already capable of changing continents. The first Australians survived and created deep, enduring cultures. But the land they entered was not the land that remained. A continent of giants became a continent of ghosts. And somewhere in that transition lies one of the darkest truths of prehistory. Humanity did not need to become modern to become dangerous. Number 2, the Neanderthal disappearance, the human cousins, we replaced and absorbed. Approximately 40,000 years ago, the last Neanderthals vanished from the earth. They had lived across Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, surviving ice ages, brutal winters, dangerous animals, and landscapes that would have destroyed weaker species. They were not the brutish cave figures old stereotypes imagined. They made tools, controlled fire, hunted large animals, cared for the injured, and buried their dead. Their bodies were powerful, their communities were social, and their knowledge of the land had been refined across generations. For a long time, Europe was their world. Then modern humans arrived, and within a few thousand years, that world no longer belonged to them. Their disappearance was not one clean catastrophe. It was slower and more frightening. Neanderthal groups were already small and scattered, often separated by great distances. Climate swings changed the environments they depended on, pushing animals into new ranges and making old hunting grounds unreliable. When Homo sapiens entered Europe, we brought new competition into a world already under pressure. We hunted many of the same animals, used many of the same shelters, and may have carried diseases to which Neanderthals had little resistance. None of these forces needed to destroy them alone. Together, repeated over generations, they were enough to turn survival into decline. What makes their extinction so haunting is how close they were to us. These were not distant animals disappearing in the background of our rise. They were another kind of human, close enough to share children with our ancestors, yet different enough to represent a separate branch of the human family tree. Their disappearance was not only replacement, it was also absorption. Many people alive today still carry Neanderthal DNA, meaning some of them entered our lineage even as their own population faded. In that sense, they did not vanish completely, but their languages, traditions, memories, and identity as a people were lost. That is the darker shape of this catastrophe. Extinction does not always look like bodies piled in one place. Sometimes it looks like fewer fires burning in the valleys each generation, fewer children born, fewer groups meeting across the landscape, fewer elders left to teach the old ways. A tool tradition can disappear when the last skilled hands are gone, and a language can die without leaving a mark on stone. A people can survive as fragments of DNA while everything that made them themselves disappears forever. The Neanderthals may have watched strangers spread into lands their ancestors had known for millennia, without understanding that history was closing around them. The final groups likely survived in refuges, in southern caves, coastal zones, and isolated landscapes where geography gave them a little more time. Imagine those last generations, small bands moving through a colder, emptier world, searching for food, mates, and familiar signs of others like them. They would not have thought of themselves as the last of a species. They would have hunted, repaired tools, protected children, and mourned their dead. But eventually, there were no distant relatives to find, no neighboring bands to join, and no future large enough to hold them. The chain that had lasted hundreds of thousands of years broke quietly. Their extinction changed the human story forever. Once the Neanderthals were gone, Homo sapiens became the only surviving human species on Earth. That loneliness feels normal to us now because we inherited a world without rivals, cousins, or alternate human voices. But for most of deep prehistory, humanity was not alone. Different kinds of humans walked the same continents, used fire, shaped stone, buried their dead, and looked at the same sky. The Neanderthal disappearance erased one of those mirrors. It left us carrying traces of them in our bodies, but not their songs, names, fears, or stories. That is why the Neanderthal disappearance belongs among the prehistoric catastrophes that almost erased humanity. It proves that being human did not guarantee survival. One branch of humanity endured for 400,000 years and still vanished when climate, competition, isolation, and chance pressed too hard. We survived, but survival was not destiny. It was the result of small advantages repeated at the right moments. The Neanderthals are gone, but not completely absent. They remain inside us like a buried memory, proof that another humanity once stood beside us, and that we became the future partly because they did not. Number 1. The great human bottleneck, the narrow thread. Every living person descends from every person alive today is the result of a chain that almost broke. Long before cities, writing, farming, kings, temples, or nations, our species passed through periods when the future of humanity may have depended on small groups of survivors scattered across dangerous landscapes. We often imagine human history as expansion. People leaving Africa, crossing continents, inventing tools, mastering fire, and slowly becoming the dominant species on Earth. But beneath that story is something darker. Again and again, the human population seems to have narrowed under the pressure of climate shocks, eruptions, droughts, disease, hunger, and competition. At several moments, the line leading to the modern world may have been thin enough that one more disaster could have ended it. And a bottleneck is not dramatic in the way a flood or asteroid is dramatic. It does not always leave a crater, a burned forest, or a drowned coastline. It leaves a signature inside descendants. When a population becomes very small, much of its genetic diversity disappears. The future is forced to pass through the bodies of the few who remain. Everyone who comes after carries the mark of that narrowing, whether they know it or not. That is what makes the human bottleneck so disturbing. The evidence is not only in ash layers, bones, or abandoned camps. It is in us. Our bodies carry the memory of ancestors who survived when others did not, and the silence of all the bloodlines that ended before they could reach the present. The exact causes and timing of ancient human bottlenecks remain debated, but the pattern is haunting. A supereruption could darken the sky and collapse food chains, and a sudden climate reversal could turn familiar lands into hunger zones. A drought could empty lakes and force people into migration. A disease could move through small groups with no immunity. Competition with other human species could squeeze fragile populations into smaller refuges. None of these disasters needed to destroy humanity alone. The danger came from accumulation. A weakened group after one catastrophe could be struck by another before recovery. Survival was not a single victory, it was a repeated escape. Imagine the world our ancestors faced during those narrow moments. There were no maps showing safer regions, no written records of past disasters, no stored knowledge beyond what a group could remember and teach. If animals left a valley, people had to follow or starve. If water dried up, they had to move. But if ash fell, they had to search for food beneath a sky that no longer behaved normally. A small decision could decide the future of millions who had not yet been born. A group choosing the wrong route might vanish. A child surviving one more winter might carry a line that would one day become nations. Entire futures balanced on fires kept burning in caves, camps, coastlines, and refuges no one can name. What makes the great human bottleneck so terrifying is that it strips away the illusion of inevitability. There was nothing guaranteed about Homo sapiens becoming the last surviving human species. Neanderthals were strong, intelligent, and adapted to their world. Other human lineages existed in Asia and beyond. For much of prehistory, we were only one branch among several, and our branch was not protected by destiny. We survived because enough of the right people endured the right disasters in the right places at the right time. Every city, language, religion, invention, and memory in the modern world depends on that fragile sequence. Pull one thread from the chain, and the entire future changes. The bottleneck also means that human history is built on absence. We are descended from survivors, but not from everyone who lived. Countless groups disappeared without names, without graves we can identify, without stories preserved by descendants. Their tools may have eroded away, their camps may be underwater, their bones may have turned to dust, they may have loved, mourned, sung, taught children and watched the same stars, but they left no living line. The modern world is not the inheritance of all ancient humans. It is the inheritance of the few whose descendants made it through the narrowing. That is why the great human bottleneck belongs at number one. It is not one disaster, but the shadow behind all of them. It is the terrifying idea that humanity exists because the line never snapped, even when it became almost impossibly thin. We are not the children of certainty. We are the children of survivors who passed through ash, cold, drought, hunger, migration, and extinction pressure before history had a voice. Everyone else is gone. Their worlds ended quietly, leaving only the lucky thread that became us.